because really it is a very interesting topic to me. But I will ask questions today, and let me introduce our panelists. And it's Philipp Fritz, who is the Warsaw correspondent of the WELT, and David Kramer, who is a senior fellow at Florida International University. And as I could already notice while Googling, that it's also writing about Eastern Partnership for a long time, such a long time as it exists, actually. So since maybe it's worth reminding, 2009. My first question to you would be, is Eastern Partnership, does the program exist in Western media at all? Because me as a journalist in Poland, even in Poland, I very often think that we do not take care of that topic enough as Polish journalists. And I'm very interested in your reflection on that, if we can start from David.
Sure. Well, Arleta and Wojciech and Tatiana, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you. And I sit here in Miami in the United States, and I will give you the American perspective. I would say, unfortunately, the Eastern Partnership is close to non-existent in the American press. I wish it were otherwise. If we talk about the partnership specifically as an overall initiative, there's very little mention. There are some think tanks and other university research and other things that are done on it. And there are reports about the countries in the Eastern Partnership. Certainly Ukraine dominated the news, not necessarily in a very good way here in the United States in 2019 and 2020, connected to the impeachment of Donald Trump. But the Belarus has been in the news, of course, particularly since last August with Lukashenko's efforts to steal an election. I've been following very closely the recent developments in Georgia, which unfortunately have not made much dent in the American media here, which I think they should. The flare-up of fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan last fall were in the news here. But again, these are about specific incidents or developments within these countries, not about the Eastern Partnership as a whole. So I don't think, at least in the American press, there is as much attention as we might hope.
Philip, do your editors ask you for Eastern Partnership topics?
Sometimes
Articles?
I ask them for Eastern Partnership topics, to be frank. But first of all, let me thank you for having me as well. Thank you for the invitation, Visegrad Insight, especially Wojciech and Tatiana and Arleta and David. It's a pleasure to meet you. In general, the countries of the Eastern Partnership, not so much the Eastern Partnership as an initiative, play a role in Western media. Western media, though, is not necessarily a good term in that context. As much as people in Central Eastern Europe don't like to be referred to as Eastern Europe, there is no one Western media or Western European perspective on things, right? I myself, I have to admit that I'm not familiar or totally aware of the representation of those countries, let's say in Portugal or Spain. My perspective here is pretty much a German perspective. But what I can say is this: I think the closer an editorial office is to the German-Polish border, the more attention is paid to what's going on in Eastern Partnership countries. And an indicator would be the number of correspondents or the editors dealing with certain topics. So for example, there's more German or German language correspondents from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland in certain countries, for example, in Ukraine, than from Italy or Spain. Right. So one might think there is more reporting on certain things in the German press than in the Italian press. And this is what I think too. This is what I can see, right? But of course, there is more, let's say, France-related topics in the German or European press than Ukraine or Belarus reported topics. I think this is something David would agree with. It needs a revolution or mass protests or a war to really have some in-depth reporting, for example, on Ukraine or Belarus on a day-to-day basis, like, for example, with the United States or France, again, from a German perspective, right? France is very important. There's a lot of France in the German press. So France, the United States, Italy to a certain extent, Russia, maybe China, right? This is it. And then for a long time, there is nothing, right? And then there's a few other countries, then again, there is nothing. And then there is Eastern Partnership countries, right? So everything's relative. I think things have gotten better after 2014, after the Maidan, after Ukraine. We learned a lot because we didn't pay attention to Ukraine at all for a long time. And then there was a revolution going on and we had nobody there, right? So we pay a little more attention to Ukraine, right? Then there's Belarus now, right? Again, as I said, it's very event driven, but all those events in recent years led to the fact that we pay a little more attention. So things got better.
But this is a specifics of mainstream media that it's events driven. But if I understand you, Philip, correctly, it's the same what already David said, that Western media, if we can use that term, even if it's not very the perfect term we could use, then it's still about the countries, not about the program, the Eastern Partnership as a program as such, right? Do Germans know what an Eastern Partnership is? Like an average German person would know if we ask on the street?
Maybe this is my personal interest perspective, but I think a lot of people know about the initiative, but they don't really know what it's about. I think, you know, a lot of people connected to former Foreign Minister Sikorski. I think there is basic knowledge about the initiative, but I mean, we're talking media, right? I mean, this is a very, you know, pol-sci topic. I mean, if you want to discuss the Eastern Partnership, its institutional or regime structures, right? I mean, go and have a pol-sci seminar, right? I mean, it's hard to discuss that in you know, mainstream media, right? I mean, what would you say about the Eastern Partnership these days, right?
Yeah, Arleta, could I just add one thing
yes,
to
course,
what Philip said? Sorry, because I feel I agree completely with Philip. Again, sorry to keep giving an American perspective, but I am an American living here.
You're here to do that.
And one of the challenges, additional challenges we face with the media, with American media, is our correspondents who cover this region are based in Moscow. You have very few, if I'm not even sure there are any American correspondents in any of the 6 Eastern Partnership countries. Now, they will occasionally go from Moscow to capitals or other parts of these countries.
Or from Berlin. I know such
or from Berlin, absolutely, when events warrant. But it is coverage that is driven largely by where they are headquartered, and that is in Moscow. And I think that also is a factor, at least in American coverage of what happens in this region.
Okay, but you both said that these countries, apart from Moldova, which was not mentioned by you, are somehow present in media in your countries. But still, I would ask you about the image of these countries. Are they perceived as still post-Soviet countries, or are they somehow linked to the European Union? What is the perspective from people in your countries, mostly in the European Union? And this is more the question, of course, about the European Union to Philip.
That's a difficult one. I would say yes and no. Aesthetically, there is a very heavy Soviet angle. I'm not saying that that's good. I'm just saying it is like that, right? So if you report on Ukraine, for example, or even Georgia, right? You quite often see pictures or images of old babushkas or Soviet style housing blocks and so on and so forth, right? So this is one thing. The other thing is that And I would link that to what David just said. Much of the reporting is related to Moscow. Geopolitics play a role here. I mean, geopolitics now is a very popular term, especially in the Polish debate all of a sudden, right? It's a little, it's a difficult, complicated term. I don't really favor the term, but there's a geopolitization of Central Eastern Europe going on, right? So, and this is because a lot of journalists put on, Moscow specs. They tend to look at the region through Moscow's eyes in a way. So why did Ukraine become important? Because there is a struggle between the Western world and Russia on Ukraine. So Ukraine became, in the eyes of a lot of Western journalists, kind of, an object rather than a subject, not a sovereign country, but a thing we're dealing with. Right, and this is what I mean by saying the Moscow perspective or Moscow specs or glasses. That indeed is a problem. But again, I think we're getting better. The other thing is, and this is why I said at first yes and no, is that there are certain phenomenons beside war and revolution and mass protests we're dealing with from time to time. Again, this is a German perspective, but linked to Georgia. There was a trend not long ago to report a lot on techno and the party scene in Georgia, which, is not war at all. It's kind of lifestyle and funky and colorful and so on, right? But, it was nice. But after a while, it was more of the same because every media outlet had, some story out of a, shady techno club in Georgia. So Georgia was the new Belgrade. And Belgrade was the new Berlin, and in the end, Georgia is the new Berlin. So that was the idea, right? Or you had the tech scene and startups in Belarus. This is not war as well, and both things aren't Soviet at all. Techno in Georgia, tech companies in Belarus, right? But then again, you got Soviet-style housing blocks. So decide for yourself. Stick to what I said, yes and no.
Okay, David, from your perspective, is it also about if it's reported, it's more about these countries or about where the Russian influence ends?
So I think in this case, from the US perspective, there's a little more positive news in the sense that I don't think most people here use the term former Soviet Union or post-Soviet much anymore. And frankly, they shouldn't. I mean, the Soviet Union has been dead for 30 years, thank goodness. And each of these countries is independent and has separate identities, and that's how we should approach them. And I do think that even though correspondents based in Moscow do a lot of that through a Moscow filter or a Russian filter, I do think a lot of the attention that is devoted to these countries is focused on these countries as individual states, and we're not using these outdated terms. There's no great term to describe the region as a whole. I use Eurasia, which is not ideal, but I think encompasses most of the countries that we're talking about. And I do think that, as Philip said, a lot of the attention does come from revolutions or protests or conflicts, as we've seen, or elections. And Moldova did get some coverage with its election. You're right. I think we had both left out Moldova in our comments. And when Maya Sandu won, that did get some media attention here in the United States. And that was a positive development for a country that has not had a great number of positive developments over the years, unfortunately. And I say that as someone who's traveled there quite a few times when I was in the government and even after, and a big fan of Moldova. And then this may get into your next question too, Arleta, but the concern I have right now is that the developments in these countries are not going very well. And I think that is also shaping the image of what we see. You look at Georgia's in a political crisis. We mentioned before the Armenia-Azerbaijan renewed conflict. Ukraine, I think, may finally be getting on track in certain areas. And this time, hopefully, we'll have a US administration here that will not use Ukraine for political purposes, but will recognize Ukraine in its own right and its own importance. Belarus, I just salute the people of Belarus for their courage and bravery against tremendous risks. but it is a tough situation in Belarus right now. And so if you look across the spectrum of these 6 countries, it's a challenge to find some positive stories, but they're there. The inspiration that I think the people of Belarus provide to people in Hong Kong or in the United States is amazing. And I don't think there's enough attention to the courage of the people in these countries and to the challenges that they try to overcome on a daily basis. A lot of the attention is focused on sort of the crisis of the moment. And unfortunately, there's been a few of those of late.
As you already touched my next question, I will maybe somehow combine 2 next questions. Asking you, David, first you said about this positive image and negative image, which is something opposite to that. We cannot say about Eastern Partnership countries as a whole, because they are very different. They are at war, as Azerbaijan and Armenia. So if you could say which of these countries have at least somehow in some aspects positive image and which have negative image. And if, for example, you mentioned Belarus, there are many positive stories, but they are not necessarily about and connected to European integration, and Eastern Partnership is about European integration. If these positive and negative aspects can be linked to the European integration or leads to the European integration.
Yeah, I mean, each of these countries does have a Russia problem. In the case of Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova, they suffer from Russian occupation. And now, and after the conflict resumed last fall between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Russia now has troops stationed in all 3 countries in the South Caucasus, with Armenia by invitation, Georgia over objections, and Azerbaijan as a way to deal with Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Belarus, Russia's playing a negative role, though they have not sent tanks across the border. And in Ukraine, of course, there's the illegal annexation of Crimea, which I commend the G7 countries for condemning on the 7th anniversary of the illegal referendum. And of course, the conflict is still going in the Donbass region. So that hangs over a lot of the image and impression we have here in the United States of these countries. But at the same time, there are positive stories. We talked about Belarus, and Philipp rightly mentioned about the tech sector and the promise and hope in that sector in Belarus. But the challenge in a country like Belarus is, as long as Lukashenko is in power, and I would say now completely illegitimately, having stolen the last election, Belarus will not be able to turn the corner toward full democracy or even beginning of democracy and toward deeper ties with the European Union. Moldova maybe can now with Maia Sandu having won the last election. Ukraine is deepening its ties. Ukraine and Georgia, of course, were promised NATO membership. So not just the EU, but they were promised NATO membership now 13 years ago. And there hasn't been a great deal of movement. So part of this depends on the progress these countries need to make. Part of it is also on us, the EU and NATO. We're obviously not a member of the EU, but we are a member of NATO. And I think we need to do a little more to help these countries. And last thing I'll say, I apologize for going on, is we have to make sure that we don't grant Russia a de facto veto over these countries' aspirations. They have every right to determine and decide which organizations they want to belong to, whether they want to become members of the EU and NATO. Those organizations have to decide whether they qualify. But if we say Georgia and Ukraine cannot become members of NATO because of Russian occupation of their territory, we are granting Russia a de facto veto over those countries' future. And that would be the wrong thing to do. Just as we should not decide that Belarus will never become a member of the EU or NATO, it's not an issue right now. The people of Belarus are protesting about Belarus. They've had enough of Lukashenko. They want to live in freedom. And if they decide they want to join NATO or the EU down the road, let them. If they want to be closer to Russia, that's their decision, but let them decide under much better conditions. Sorry.
Thank you. But you said a very important thing, and I couldn't agree more. But if we go back to this image of these countries in Western media, Philip, if you could at least try to summarize, if there is a country which has a positive image and can be an example for other countries, and if there is a country who has an image that can be a bad example of what not to do, because image of these countries in media influence the decisions of the politicians. It's obvious, of course.
To a certain degree, yes, though I'm not really sure if there is any country that has a positive image abroad anyways, right? I think this is not necessarily related to the Eastern Partnership countries. I mean, journalists and I myself, I am a journalist, not a PR company. You know, we most of the time try to report what we see, what's going on. And if there is revolution, mass protests, torture is in the example of Belarus and Lukashenko, horrible things. I mean, again, you decide for yourself if that leads to a positive image. It simply is what it is. And I too salute the Belarusian people. I mean, it's amazing that they've been protesting for so many months. But you know, I'm not really sure if I'm capable to answer your question. But if you look in for positive stories, maybe I can tell you about a story I wrote last year about Belarus. Was in late summer when I traveled from Berlin to Prague to meet a woman from Belarus who lives in Prague, an artist actually, who works on those Belarusian folk patterns, selling them and posting pictures of them online on Instagram. And she was a year ago, 2 years ago, not political at all. She moved to the Czech Republic because, you know, because she's a professional and she wanted to work on her artistic skills, right? But then all of a sudden, when her friends started protesting, she became interested in politics, and she published those patterns she's been working on for years. But she added those protest scenes or security forces beating up protesters, but within those Belarusian folk patterns, right? Became a hit on Instagram, right? And she kind of united her friends after those patterns, right? I mean, I saw that, got in touch with her, we met, and I wrote down her story in light of the events in Belarus. And I thought, okay, this is more than just news, right? This is some in-depth reporting, you know. And now, you know, maybe I sound too much like a journalist. I'm sorry, but you know, this was sexy. It was colorful. You know, there was a lot about it, right? And now, guess what? It didn't sell at all. Right, we published it, and I think it sold 3 times, and it was summer, right? And I mean, we're a big news outlet, right? I don't know how many clicks we got a day, but you know, it's millions, right? Sold 3 times, and you know, it was the height of the Belarusian protests in summer, right? And now ask yourself what's going on at the moment, right? I mean, do you sell any text related to Belarus? I mean, there is the news, right? People realized that there were 2 Belsat journalists in front, you know, of a court. But besides that, I mean, it's very, very, very difficult to sell, you know, as I said, sexy topics related to conflicts. It is just complicated. You have to ask yourself, you know, how to unpack those things and how to contextualize those things. It's horribly complicated, and I don't know what I could say here. If somebody from Belarus or Ukraine or Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, if they want more media representation, right? I mean, if they want their countries to be represented in Western media more often, you know, if they don't want more war or revolution or unrest or conflict with Russia, I don't see, to be frank, any way for them to get more representation or to get more media coverage, unfortunately.
This is very sad what you say, but I understand you perfectly, and I'm also a journalist, and I know how difficult it is to sell these topics even in Poland, and we are closer to them. But correct me if you have a different opinion, but I still think that these stories somehow build the image of the country. For example, when Georgia, long time ago, started this changing police not to be corrupted as much, and they had these aquariums and so on, every Western outlet was writing about it because it was interesting. And if, for example, I say it's too early maybe to say it is happening, but if President Zelensky really started a war with oligarchs and started de-oligarchization, if we can call it so, then it would be a success story, and these stories would build an image of the country. And what happened to Belarusian women as a group, that they started to be an object, a part of politics, which they didn't used to be. These stories somehow build the image for future. I don't know if Belarus, even if Lukashenko is gone, would like to be a part of the European Union, but such stories make it more understandable for Western societies that these countries could be a part of their European Union, so to say, in simplification. I don't know if you agree or not, but this is somehow my idea of that.
I mean, to reply briefly, yes. I mean, reporting might lead to decision-making related to a positive or negative image of somebody or something abroad. I agree with that, but I'm not really interested in that. I mean, my perspective is, democracy, human rights, liberal values. I think this is where we all stand. But I'm not interested in, if somebody's looking good or bad, right? What I hear in Poland quite often is, when you write about Poland, we always look so bad, right? you criticize us all the time because, form of the judiciary and so on and so forth. And my reaction most of the time is, yeah, I don't care, right? If you don't want me to report on the reform of the judiciary, just don't do the reform of the judiciary. It's the same with Zelensky. I mean, if he's going to go for the oligarchs, might be a success. But if he fails, it's not a success, right? And frankly, so what? I mean, I'd report on it anyways. So. I'm sorry, I'm not really sure if this is a good reply to what you just said, but maybe you get my point.
I think I do. There is a question on chat, but we'll go back to it in a second. I will just ask my last question, and then we'll go to your questions to the panelists. My last question is Russian disinformation. We talk about it more and more, and I think it's very important because it's a big problem in media, not only in European Union media, in the US as well. David, can you tell us, do you think that Russian disinformation is also aiming in disinforming about Eastern Partnership and Eastern Partnership countries?
I do, and look, I salute President Zelensky and the Ukrainian efforts. Sorry.
Home office.
The challenges of doing these things live from home. What can I say? My dogs agree with me. Whatever I've just said. Sorry. What I was saying is. I salute what President Zelensky and Ukrainian officials are doing in cracking down on this. I think this is overdue. I think closing down and sanctioning the pro-Russian stations of Medvedchuk and Kozak that's exactly the right thing to do. Why? First of all, these aren't news outlets. They're propaganda outlets. And second, Ukraine is at war. Ukraine didn't declare war, didn't ask for war, but Russia invaded Ukraine. And in light of that, I think you have to take these measures, because what those outlets and Russian disinformation are trying to do is to sow further chaos in the countries and to dredge up the pro-Russian sentiment. Now, I don't think they're working all that well, but still, I think these are the right measures to take. Russian disinformation in Georgia, for sure. There have been studies done by this. A friend of mine who runs the Economic Policy Research Center did a report with the McCain Institute on Russian disinformation. And of course, Belarus is a perfect example where you had TV presenters who finally did the right thing after Lukashenko's election. They resigned, and what happens? RT sends a whole team of TV presenters to take their place. Again, I use the term TV presenters deliberately because they're not journalists. RT and Sputnik are not media organizations. They are dangerous propaganda outlets. And I worry, I saw a recent Spiegel piece about RT in Germany. It's not just in these Eastern Partnership countries, and it's here in the United States. We just had a report released by the National Intelligence Council that was talking about Russian efforts to interfere in our elections that includes disinformation. And part of our problem is we have either witting or unwitting agents in our own countries making the task of Russian disinformation easier. So we need to clean up our own house, and we need to get tougher with these, what I would consider to be very badly intended outlets that are trying to cause problems in our countries.
But you say, David, about cleaning our own house as well, but it's also a question about meddling in perception of Eastern Partnership countries in your country, because of course, from Moscow perspective, it is their sphere of influence.
Yeah, and it won't surprise you that I completely reject that notion. Nor do I use the term.
Rejected, but I say that when I lived in Moscow for 4 years, and I know how do they think about this.
No, you're absolutely right, Arleta. That is exactly how they describe it as their near abroad. The problem is that they need to come to grips with the fact that after 1991, these countries are independent. I understand they have a lot of interest in what happens in these countries, but here's where Putin's interests and Russia's national interests diverge. Putin does not want to see these countries succeed. He does not want to see them become vibrant democracies. He does not want to see them integrate more into the Euro-Atlantic community. Russia's national interest, if Putin were to step out of the picture, would be they would want to have vibrant democracies along their border. They would want to have closer ties between them and their neighbors and the rest of the Euro-Atlantic community. And so this is why Putin does not want these countries to succeed, because they would become threatening alternatives to the system he has overseen for the past 20 years in Russia. And so this is where I think we have to do a much better job. We, Europe and the United States together, need to do a much better job in rejecting this idea that Russia has a de facto veto over these countries. And we have to do a better job of helping these countries as they aspire to join the Euro-Atlantic community.
Philipp, do you think that Russian disinformation and propaganda success somehow in influencing this Western perception of the Eastern Partnership countries?
I mean, first of all, I totally agree with everything David just said. And it is Russian disinformation and propaganda is a big problem. I mean, this is a problem of a magnitude we can underestimate. And we don't need to look just at Eastern Partnership countries or at what Russians or Moscow might think is the Russian sphere of influence. But you look at the United States, right? I mean, I don't have to remind you what President Biden just said. I mean, there is a conflict going on here. Look at Germany. It's not just Russian propaganda efforts. There is a lot of useful idiots involved as well. I mean, just recently, a big Berlin media outlet published an interview with the Russian ambassador to Germany, who just talked about the reunification of the Russian motherland and the Crimea. And the journalist just let him talk. And this is what I mean, right? There is Russian propaganda efforts, there is disinformation campaigns, and then there is people who serve on that same wave. I don't know if they do it deliberately or if we're at a point already where certain things, became normal, got normalized, like the reunification of Crimea and Russia. What's that supposed to be, right? So as I said, the journalists talking to the ambassador just didn't disagree. I was stunned. I was shocked when I read that interview. So this is one thing, and the other thing, and I think this is what you related to, is that to a certain degree, of course, Russian disinformation campaigns shape Western reporting on, for example, Ukraine and Belarus. Again, I don't know if certain people do that kind of reporting deliberately, or things just happen, but that is a problem. I mean, I don't know if you remember that campaign. It was about Ukraine, that Russian media outlets like Sputnik and others were trying to convince Western media that there is, since Maidan, there is a lot of more anti-Semitism in Ukraine, right? I don't know if you remember that. Of course, there is anti-Semitism in Ukraine. There is anti-Semitism everywhere, right? The right question would be, is there more anti-Semitism than usual? In the case of Ukraine, I would say no. I traveled to Ukraine myself, talked to people from Jewish communities, and they told me, yeah, of course, there are some right-wingers and some nationalists, right? But we don't feel threatened. It's not more anti-Semitic than it was 5 years ago, right? And, Russian propaganda outlets were claiming that a lot of Ukrainian Jews were leaving for Israel. There was a huge exodus and so on and so forth. And, what I found out being in Ukraine was, one community, somebody said to me, one guy from our community left for Israel, and he did that, for vacation. So this is just one example, and there are a lot of disinformation campaigns like that, and we gotta have to double check. Right, this is complicated times for Western journalists dealing with those countries, or even triple check. Exactly. And again, I'm not saying that every claim is totally 100% wrong, right? Of course, again, there is anti-Semitism in Ukraine, but it was not necessarily related to what happened on the Maidan, right? Just to give you one example. So again, it's a problem we gotta have to be aware.
Okay, just my remark that when RT as Russia Today was formed, nobody actually cared about it. And a few years later, it appeared that it's a very powerful weapon because it is a weapon now. Now I will.
Actually, Arleta, can I just say, because you mentioned this, and I think what you just said is a very important point. When Russia Today, because that's what it was called when it first was formed, I think in 2005, the objective was to try to promote the image of Russia.
Positive image of Russia.
And that changed after the invasion of Georgia around late 2008, 2009, and when it became RT, and then Sputnik came along as well. The objective was not to promote the image of Russia anymore. The objective was to denigrate and criticize and slam us meaning the West writ large, and basically to argue we in the West are no better than they are. Who are we to criticize? It's the whataboutism. We just saw that yesterday with Putin, and when he was asked about President Biden's comment, when President Biden said, yes, Putin is a killer. By the way, applause to President Biden for speaking the truth. And Putin launched.
It was just a matter of question, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, exactly. But still, I think President Biden has the right approach. But Putin launched into the whataboutism that Russian propaganda is famous for. And instead of dealing, look, I'm not going to, but I could talk for hours about the problems and challenges we face in the United States. January 6th was one of the darkest days in our history. And I'm happy to discuss that. But when you raise criticism and concerns about what's happening in Russia, it's never an opportunity to discuss what's happening in Russia. It's always, who are you to criticize us? We should all approach this with a huge dose of humility. But at the same time, we also have an obligation to speak out for what Philipp was describing about democracy and freedom and human rights, because the people in Belarus, the people in Georgia, and all these countries look to us for at least moral and political support, if nothing else.